Wow, well, we're really in the deep end of the pond. He's asking what is the connection between what some people would call the ascended masters or very enlightened beings who've left their bodies or in other dimensions and realms, and these extraterrestrial beings. I would say it's the same connection, but perhaps more intimate, that humans can have. Now, the difference is, if you are an interstellar civilization, if you guys could be quiet out there, thanks. If you're an interstellar civilization, you're going to be able to go from one star system to another only if you have become cosmologically competent. Now, what do I mean by that? I wrote a paper back in 1995, I believe, called ETs and the New Cosmology, that talks about this expanded view of the cosmology of a universe that includes other dimensions and other realms that are increasingly conscious. And this explains a lot of the experiences people have when they're near an extraterrestrial vehicle, where it will have an effect in consciousness. And they will begin to have, similar to the ending of the movie Contact that Jodie Foster was in, where it's almost like in a dream state. Why is that? Well, when you start dealing with technologies that permit not only transportation but communication beyond the light barrier, let's look at it that way, beyond the box of space-time, then you're moved into a world that is increasingly conscious and in the thought realm. And for that reason, those civilizations that are interstellar are very, very familiar with what we would call remote viewing, the ability to have the mind awaken into this field of consciousness that's non-local and see other points in space or time, but also other beings and other worlds. Can that be done electronically? Yes. The big secret in the intelligence community that I learned back in 1994 was that the remote viewing programs that the CIA and NSA had that were based purely on meditative and consciousness efforts was the part they were happy to let the people know about. But that in I believe it was 1956, a man that I met before he passed away had invented some electronics that would permit some of these operatives in the intelligence community to electronically hook up and literally see through other dimensions in consciousness, other places. And that was the high end of the so-called remote viewing programs that were based on trans-dimensional electronic systems, which I understand very, very well, and which have been used since the 50s. So if we have that in our classified programs, I'm quite sure that an interstellar civilization has things that would be generation 100 of that. And that would mean, and answering your question in a way that has some foundation in logic, that their ability to perceive these other dimensions and realms would be augmented. Now, that is limited by the level of consciousness of the perceiver. So what that means is everything is really, in that sense, based on what your level of development in consciousness is. So if you have developed the ability to be in a state of transcendent cosmic awareness, you can perceive a certain amount beyond space and time. If you've gotten to the point that you can see the finest aspects of that, what in the Vedas are called celestial perception, you're going to be able to sense that. If you can see beyond that, then you're in this what's called the state of unity consciousness. And it goes on, and that's just the beginning. But so those abilities of perception are very much dependent on the level of consciousness of the perceiver. So it would vary with different civilizations and what their capabilities are, but certainly their capabilities would be beyond what we are able to actuate through AT&T. In other words, just a linear electromagnetic communication system. And you know, years ago when I was had this meeting with the CIA director and his wife, which they subsequently denied, but luckily I have the documents, I have it sitting right here that can prove it happened. I always joke in Washington, how do you know they're lying? Their lips are moving. So, more truth to that than people want to realize. But at any rate, the wife of the CIA director was a scientist and was the chief operating officer of the National Academy of Sciences, and she asked me over dinner, we were there, it was a 3-hour meeting almost, my wife was with me and can verify this, and she asked, not that question, but she asked, how are these civilizations communicating across the vastness of interstellar space? And I thought, oh God, do I tell her the truth and lose all credibility? Or do I tell her something that sounds scientific, but that I know is rubbish? And I decided then that I don't care how high the person's status in society was, if they asked the question, they deserve an honest answer. So I explained to her that, and I think this is something people really need to understand about these technologies. A great launching point from these sort of technologies that can bring us to the next level of our civilization to eliminate poverty, pollution, et cetera, and so on, and the geopolitical morass of oil politics. But when you start dealing with these sciences on a more profound level, you break into these trans-dimensional physics that deal with communication systems. And I explained that, look at our galaxy, the Milky Way, is only one of billions of galaxies. It's a very average spiral galaxy. The Andromeda galaxy is 2.5 million light years away, which is the distance of a beam of light going 186,000 miles per second, would travel for 2.5 million years. But let's take our own galaxy is 100,000 light years across. So that's the distance, a beam of light going 186,000 miles every second. Every second is 186,000 miles for 100,000 years. Okay, but that's just our own galaxy. So let's say that there's a star system 1,000 light years away, which is only 1% of the distance from where we are, because we're on one of the outer spiral arms of the galaxy. 1%, 1,000 light years. Using your cell phone or a radio wave, anything at the speed of light, it would take 1,000 years to get a signal there to that home planet, and 1,000 years to get an answer back. It's the time since the birth of Christ to say, hello, how are you? Fine, thank you very much. So what I explained to the CIA director and his wife is that the speed of light's just too slow. So the communication, as well as transportation systems that allow for them to be here, are something that are beyond linearity, that cross over into non-locality. What Einstein called the spooky phenomenon, where two things materialize and can appear at two different places instantly, and that kind of thing. So this non-locality in physics, when it's put into a reproducible electromagnetic system, can then cross through these dimensions so that the star system 1,000 light years from us and Earth can be, get it, in resonance. There's no distance. Linearity is gone. That line between here and there is gone. And you're going not through a wormhole, but you're actually going through these dimensions that are folded within time and space, where the speed of light, time, mass, and those things do not factor into the equations. Does that make sense? And therefore, one of the things that I discovered years ago, Dr. Robert Woods, who's one of our Disclosure Project witnesses who had worked with McDonnell Douglas, that was then bought by Boeing, he was very interested in an assessment I did in 1991, back in my misspent youth, so when I was in my 30s. And in this paper, which was called the Comprehensive Assessment of the UFO ETI, Extraterrestrial Intelligence Subject. It was sort of a white paper, and it's in my first book that you can get on the internet at our store. And in that, I described TAC technology-assisted consciousness, and CAT, consciousness-assisted technologies. So that you can have a technology, as I was saying, that assists consciousness and thought. For example, that was what that 1956 invention that this genius that I had met had invented that ended up getting bought out by a front company for the CIA can do. Or you can have your consciousness assist the technology, say for communication. So it goes both ways. So it's the interface between thought stuff, say a thoughtron instead of an electron, and this dimension. But it's very, very sophisticated technologies. And that's what these civilizations are using for communication. But that also means that they're traversing into these other dimensions that some would call, that you might experience when you have a near-death experience. Or when you have a lucid, how many people have had a lucid flying dream where you're flying? Almost everyone. Well, you know, actually what's happening in those lucid flying dreams, and particularly if it crosses over into a precognitive dream, you're actually in that aspect of yourself that is conscious, and the so-called body of light is actually no longer restricted by the confines of the body and space-time, and therefore you can actually traverse these kind of worlds of light and see what's going to happen tomorrow. But imagine being able to do that on a reproducible basis with electronic assist, all right? And your whole then spacecraft does the whole thing because it transitions out of linear space-time. So that would mean that the ability to explore those other dimensions would be greatly augmented. It doesn't mean that it's more than we can experience because people have experienced near-death experiences and other dimensions and what have you, either in meditation or near-death experiences or just spontaneously. And it's sort of an awakening that happens in consciousness. But it also means that if you're an interstellar civilization, you're going to have a means to assist with that and augment that and facilitate it on a reproducible basis. But again, even for them, the perceptual capabilities are limited by the level of consciousness of the perceiver, because you get into finer and finer and finer and finer and finer dimensions. Someone once asked me, how many dimensions are there? I said, how many numbers are there between 0 and infinity? So it's infinity within infinity within infinity. There's not any limit. So what we're trying to explore in our little project, well, and of course this is actually how I got involved in all these issues, is 6 months after my near-death experience, I had learned meditation because I was going, wow, I was raised a very devout atheist, science, and we were very devout atheists. You weren't allowed to believe in anything you couldn't put in a test tube. And so when I had that experience, it was so profound, and it was so cosmic in awareness that I began to learn meditation techniques. And I picked one that was sort of a Vedic mantra technique. And I began to have all these experiences, and I was up on this mountaintop in North Carolina, and I was going to meditate, and one of these spacecraft materialized just before sunset. Same spacecraft I'd seen when I was 8 or 9 years old in Charlotte, North Carolina, as a little boy. And I went, oh, they're back. I didn't think anything else more about it, and it was there, and then it just vanished. It didn't fly off. I went, oh, cool. So I was there meditating, and sitting on this mountaintop in October. It was freezing up there. I had a jacket on, ski jacket. And I went into such a beautiful state of consciousness that I lost all track of time. There was no time. Transcended into this pure conscious state. Sitting up at 5,000 feet up in the mountains of North Carolina, I love. I think it's my Cherokee. I'm part Cherokee Indian, so I have this great love for those mountains. And so at the end, I kind of stood up and I looked at the sky, and it was like this beautiful thought came, behold what a beautiful universe God has made. And with that, I went into the same state I was in when I had my near-death experience, but I was in my body. And then there was this little ET beside me that touched me on my right shoulder, and all my hair stood on end. Now, that's when I had some hair, or more hair, and it was longer. I mean, this is 1974. So it was a wonderful experience, but that was I didn't understand the physics of what had happened in terms of the contact that ensued and followed, but now I do. And I think that it's an amazing science that unfortunately, we're just beginning to emerge out of sort of a Newtonian fossil fuel, trying to come out of that. But there's so much more progress that's been made in classified scientific programs. Now, you can imagine hearing a little bit of this, why these folks at the CIA call some of these technologies WSFM, weird science and frickin' magic, and why the parent group operating on the NRO document, that's the first document in the Obama briefing, is from the National Reconnaissance Office, which runs all the super secret spy satellites. And you'll see it says MAJIC, magic, is one of the compartmented operations. Cosmic Ops, Magic Ops, boom. That's an authentic document. And it's because and there's an area of Nellis Air Force Base, which people mistakenly call Area 51. No one in the know calls it that, by the way. Nobody. That is called Dreamland. And this document mentions Dreamland MOC, a military operating center. And one of the reasons why that crept into the parlance of people doing experiments with these electronics is that when you're in that state using those, it is like having a lucid flying dream. That's where Dreamland came from. Now there's a little secret that you won't hear many places, but it makes sense if you understand what a lucid dream is, if you understand what the conscious aspect of the cosmos is, if you understand what thought really is and thought forms are. It all begins to make sense. And so when McDonnell Douglas, old man McDonald, of McDonnell Douglas, asked, I'm getting to another point here, asked Dr. Wood to go and look at this subject. He started finding cases, and he found a number of cases where people had contact events with objects, and this is way back in the 60s when this was happening more often because there weren't the weapon systems we have now targeting extraterrestrial vehicles. People would have these experiences, and in broad daylight sometimes. There was one case that he looked into, I think it was in the Baja California, where a craft had landed, there were these beings outside of it. They were very much in this dimension, and they had a little black, sort of like a communication thing, that would directly communicate with thought instead of with words. But not just like, oh, I'm going to guess an intuitive telepathic, the amazing Kreskin nonsense. But I mean, zap, just like, but it was clearly into the oral cortex coming from these electronics. And Dr. Wood, who's an aerospace engineering guy, Cornell guy, reported this back, and there was a reason why a lot of the early McDonnell Douglas secret stuff, the Phantom Works, and they had a lot of his planes named after these sort of concepts. I forget the names of them, some of them. It's all very historic, you can look it up. But that goes back to the 60s. And here we are 50 years later, still dealing with rather primitive concepts of physics. So that's why when you start thinking about civilizations, let's say a civilization's been around for hundreds of thousands to millions of years longer than we have, which in a universe that's 14 billion years old, there's no reason why not. And you take the technological advances that have been made in the last 100 years, not just the things most people know about, but these classified programs. And then you put that on an exponential curve for hundreds of thousands to millions of years. Every manifestation of that civilization would look like magic. More so than if you went back and visited Thomas Jefferson 200 years ago out here at Monticello and showed him an iPhone or something. This would be less spectacular than the normal everyday world of these interstellar civilizations, which is why we have to have a sense of humility scientifically, that the fact is that we're just on the very beginnings of scientific and conscious exploration. And everyone thinks history is over, and every generation of scientists thinks they know everything. But we don't. And so there has to be the acknowledgement that we're just beginning on this journey. Now, In the realm of mystic literature and people who've had experiences in consciousness, I think many things that have been portrayed as miracles actually they're certainly miraculous to the people who saw it, but there's probably an understanding both in the science of consciousness, but maybe even in technological sciences that would explain it. That people don't want to hear this part, but because this steps on some theological toes, no. So one of the issues about disclosure and this whole issue, you're not just stepping on the toes of the orthodoxy of science, macroeconomics, and technology, but you might step on some theological toes when you start moving into some of this discussion, which is, get you in hot water very quickly. But, and I've been in enough of hot water to know whereof I speak in terms of that paradigm. But, it's okay. I remember years ago I was meeting with a man at JPL. He tracked me down at a restaurant, actually, Jet Propulsion Labs, and he started talking to me about the fact that he had seen the non-sanitized images from Mars, where there were structures, very ancient structure. And even Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, has recently said, we need to go back there and see some of these obelisks, these big objects that appear to be artificial. He can't talk about what he saw at the moon because he's been told he can't, but he can talk about these other things that he's looked into, which is why he has begun to speak about it. So this is a very interesting case because I said, well, why don't you at least disclose that? Because some of these structures apparently are very ancient, as in the millions of years possibly old. Now, that would make sense. I mean, the Earth's been here for 4.6 billion years. The solar system is billions of years old, so millions of years is not that much. And he said, oh no. He says, because even though it's not something that would point to any contemporary, he said, if that knowledge was disclosed, it would collapse the fundamentalist and orthodox belief systems of every religion on earth. And I said, well, good. It's childhood's in. I mean, fine. He says, no, you don't understand how powerful those interests are. And this was a scientist saying this. This was not someone at the Vatican. So part of the problem with disclosure is that it opens up a whole bunch of issues that people would rather just not deal with. And this is one of them, including this question of other dimensions and intelligence that aren't physical. Now, this is a really important thing about the issue. People get into what I call cosmological indigestion. They can't digest. So you can have an experience with an interstellar civilization that has trans-dimensional capabilities that cross into this realm of thought and consciousness and what have you. That's what we do when we go out under the stars with my team. But then you could have also an experience with intelligences that are not from a star system, but that are from just other dimensions and realms that are purely conscious in the worlds of light, as it's called. And you could be forgiven for confusing the two, because depending on how they manifest. Now, I had a hilarious conversation with this senior theologian at the Vatican a few years ago. He's actually in the Disclosure Project material, but we didn't have good translation for Italian. And he said, look, he says, angels don't need flying saucers. I said, yes, of course, but there's a point where when an interstellar vehicle resonantly shifts into that dimension, depending on their capabilities, they get very close to that realm, don't they? And he said, yes. So there is an understanding of it, but most people will conflate one experience with another, so that anything that is weird or goes bump in the night, they're going to think is the same phenomenon, when it's a multiplicity of phenomena, plural.